Hello and welcome to The View from 22, the first View from 22 of 2024. And I am delighted to be joined by Peter Wood, who is president of the National Association of Scholars in America. And we're going to be talking about another scholar of sorts, Claudine Gay, who resigned this week as president of Harvard following accusations of plagiarism. Peter, for our British viewers and listeners, could you just give us a little bit of an overview of the story, because they probably haven't been following it too closely?
Yes, a scholar named, or a journalist named Chris Rufo discovered and published evidence that Claudine Gay had plagiarized portions of her Harvard PhD dissertation from the late 1990s. Less than a day after that, a journalist at the Washington Examiner, I think it was, published a story in which he documented extensive plagiarism in 4 of President Gay's 11 published articles in academic journals. Since that time, others have discovered additional instances of plagiarism, both in the journals, the dissertation, and in other published journals. So half of her material now, more than half of her published articles have documented plagiarism in them, and her dissertation has been vitiated by academic dishonesty.
Well, and I've seen that she's written a response in the New York Times, and there's been lots of comment in kind of what people like to call legacy media about this story, suggesting that she was the victim of a kind of right-wing hit job. I mean, she said she was part of a broader war that conservatives are fighting, a broader culture war. What's your view on that?
Well, she's by no means a victim. She's a perpetrator, but it is true that there is something broader going on here than simply the exposure of a dishonest academic. The story really involves how President Gay was chosen to be president of Harvard. She had campaigned for a number of years as a champion of the diversity, equity, inclusion movement, including a letter that she'd written in August of 2020 to the entire faculty of the College of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, in which she laid out an ambitious plan to eliminate the scourge of white supremacy, which she characterized as the second pandemic. And this would require using extensive racial preferences in hiring faculty members, in bringing in postgraduate fellows, student admissions overall. The non-faculty staff of the university would be selected and promoted on the fast track on the basis of race. And she was concerned about the appearances on campus of buildings named after and portraits of white people that had to be replaced in a manner that would make people of color feel more comfortable at the institution. This was a sort of breathtakingly broad idea of transforming Harvard University from a place that prioritized the pursuit of truth. The 350-some-year-old motto of the university is Veritas, and this was now to be an institution that was primarily concerned with Gay's version of social justice, and everything else would go by the boards. So what else is going on? What else is going on is an effort to push back against this revolution at Harvard.
Yes. Do you think perhaps, just in terms of her mistakes, just from a purely careerist point of view, not from a moral point of view, do you think perhaps her bigger mistake was not the white supremacy DEI stuff, which, although I see there is a pushback against it this year, and let's get on to that, her big mistake was to do with October 7th and the response of Harvard, both on the campus and from the authorities, which Gay was the ultimate authority as president, that Harvard was seen to be endorsing anti-Semitism, and that led to another pushback against her.
Well, the very same day that Hamas engaged in its atrocities in Israel, later that day, a bunch of Harvard students came forward representing, I think it was 34 student organizations, pronouncing that Hamas was in the right, and this was an appropriate action to take against the colonial power of Israel. Um, when that happened, Gay's immediate response was to defend the rights of free speech of these pro-Hamas demonstrators, and saying not a word about the danger they posed, calling for the murder of Jews to Jewish members of the faculty and student body at Harvard. The reaction to her non-interest in that important detail was very swift, and within about another day of that, she issued a temporizing statement in which she seemed to be saying that, well, mass murder is not quite as good as I thought it was, and we do need to defend the Jewish students at Harvard. That didn't sit well either. It was seen as an anemic response to a very grave provocation. And soon after, she issued yet another statement, which had a little bit more spine in it, but not that much. I think she was correctly seen by the Jewish community at Harvard as not a friend, but maybe somebody who could be pushed into saying at least a few things in support of fairness and justice, and that was about it. That's how things stood. There were significant major donors to Harvard University who pulled back their money. There was a flurry of criticism, at least in the conservative press in the US, but she didn't back down in any significant way at all. And that went forward until her testimony, along with two other college presidents at the House of Representatives Committee on Education and the Workforce, where a congresswoman from New York, Elaine Stefanik, asked her some pointed questions about whether it was in violation of Harvard's anti-harassment policy to allow death threats to be made against the Jewish students.
And Dr. Gay, at Harvard, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment, yes or no?
It can be, depending on the context.
What's the context?
Targeted as an individual, at an individual.
It's targeted at Jewish students, Jewish individuals. Do you understand your testimony is dehumanizing them? Do you understand that dehumanization is part of anti-Semitism? I will ask you one more time. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment, yes or no?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric.
And is it anti-Semitic rhetoric?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric, when it crosses into conduct that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action.
So the answer is yes, that calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard Code of Conduct, correct?
Again, it depends on the context.
It does not depend on the context. The answer is yes, and this is why you should resign. These are unacceptable answers across the board.
She could not find it in herself to say that there was any significant violation of Harvard's disciplinary policies. Her answer there, where she echoed the two other college presidents, was that it depends on context. And Stefanik appropriately asked, in what context is it appropriate to call for genocide, for which she really had no answer at all.
Well, that leads us on to a rather sensitive area, which people are very nervous to tread on, so perhaps we should be too. And that's the anti-Semitism of black leaders in America, often on the progressive radical left. And for decades, a lot of people say, these figures have gotten away with saying quite viciously anti-Semitic things, and that's no longer the case, or seems to be stopping a little bit, would you say?
Well, it's put the brakes on the anti-Semitism that is I'm not sure it's an ancient part of the Black American community, but it's been long-standing. We had anti-Semitic riots in the Black community here in the 1960s and 70s, and it's sort of deeply rooted within that community. The um, I would not go so far to say that all the prominent black leaders in the U.S. Have a covert anti-Semitic agenda, but some do, and those are the ones who are most prominent on the left. At the moment, we also have the issue of the 1619 Project. The New York Times celebrated journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones. Uh, we have Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me, a memoir that he puts forward, which essentially claims that all of white America is racist. And then Ibram X. Kendi, whose work has launched the idea that anti-racism involves installing a regime of racial preferences that is pro-black. Now, those are probably the three leading intellectual figures, if they can be called that, in the American black community. And all three of them traffic in at least undertones, and sometimes rather explicitly, in anti-Semitism. And that's not to mention people like Jesse Jackson, who's had a very long history of anti-Semitic maneuvering in his public statements.
Christopher Rufo, the journalist who sort of first exposed Gay's plagiarism, you mentioned him earlier. He has already been accused of being a Russian spy, I think, for his journalism on this, which I suppose is fairly typical. But he also has written a very interesting essay, quite a radical essay, in a new conservative magazine called IM 1776. And I don't know if you've seen that essay, but it really is quite radical, so much so that you can't really necessarily say it's conservative. And I think even within the piece, he addresses that he thinks the time has come for the left-wing takeover of America's institutions is so complete that the right no longer needs conservatism. They need a new kind of radicalism to march back through the institutions. And I suppose a lot of people will see his scalp, as it's been called controversially, of Claudine Gay as a first blow in his war against America's progressive woke institutions.
Well, first, I'm not familiar with that particular essay, although I know Christopher and have read quite a bit of his other writings. So I get that idea. My own organization, the National Association of Scholars, is devoted to reform of higher education, not its eradication and replacement, although I have many members who have some sympathy for the idea that the leftist control of the institutions is now so deeply entrenched that something fairly radical will be needed to displace it. I should say that Christopher was by far the first on the scene to report the plagiarism. He wasn't the first to notice it. That was back in October when several of us had hands on this material and were working to find somewhere in the mainstream press that would agree to publish it. The newspaper here in New York City, the New York Post, had the material. They conferred with me about it and with other scholars who confirmed that it was plagiarism, but were scared off the story because the Harvard hit them with an attorney who said he would sue them for defamation if they ran it. So they were holding their peace for a while. So the word has been out among a fair number of us that a major plagiarism scandal was in the offing. We were just waiting for the moment when the story would broke, and Christopher was the first to do that.
So, sorry, just to confirm, that's very interesting. You people within the National Association of Scholars had this information as far back as when? As late last year?
No, mid-October.
And I mean, that I can't help noticing is a few days after October 7th and the row we were talking about then, there will be people who will conclude that it may have been non-journalistic actors providing that information. Do you know whether it was or wasn't?
It was certainly non-journalistic actors. It was professors, academics who had first taken notice of the plagiarized material, but who were in no position to bring it to public attention. for one thing, bringing it to public attention could be a career-ending movement by them. So the effort was to find someone who could project it to the public. I was approached on this because I'm independent. I'm working as the head of a nonprofit organization that works on academic reform, but I don't have command of the major media, so I could contact journalists, but we were really looking for a major newspaper that would say, here's the material, take a look at it. Christopher Rufo forced their hand by putting out material and then working hard to draw broader public attention to it. So hats off to him.
Well, let's talk about this counter-revolution that seems to be in the offing and seems to be already a theme of this year, particularly with an election coming up and the cultural wars that are bound to surround that. There does seem to be quite a lot of energy on the right now for fighting, for not violence, let's hope, but for fighting back. Trump talked about it a lot, and a lot of Trump supporters talking about it, but now it's not necessarily MAGA Republicans or whatever you want to call them. It's often very liberal people who are just fed up of this progressive indoctrination in universities and this chokehold that the radical left has over America's higher institutions.
Well, a good number of the supporters of my organization consider themselves to be liberals. We don't identify with party or with an ism, but clearly there is a broad disgust with the willingness of the academic left to engage in censorship, to prevent the expression of opinions which are at odds with what passes as the party line for the moment. But there's also the issue of faculty members who cannot get started in their careers or continue in their careers because they drift away from the established line. That brings us back to the diversity, equity, inclusion business. We deal with faculty members. Right now, I'm in the midst of a case with a fellow at Ohio Northern University, not a terribly distinguished place, but he decided that he would oppose that institution's DEI rules, and for his efforts, he was fired. Now, as a tenured professor, to be fired is a relatively unusual thing in the U.S., but that shows you the degree of vehemence with which the DEI agenda is now advanced. Merely to question it is to put your career at risk, or worse. So this ferment leading to something like revolutionary desire to change the university is quite real. It is not, however, preeminent within any college or university that I know about. There, the DEI agenda, the fight against racism as it is perceived, is taken to be a nearly holy cause, which is grounds for taking almost any kind of action against the dissenters. So speaking for the dissenters, which I will say are not simply conservative, and they're certainly not merely a right-wing bunch, although there is a right-wing element to it, we are the people who think that American higher education should be founded in the pursuit of truth, that intellectual freedom is a key value, that understanding the role of universities in helping to sustain our civilization from generation to generation are all great and good things, that those have become compromised by a willingness to direct the energies of the university into propagandizing students in favor of various left-wing causes is the essential problem. Now, we don't all agree on what all those issues are. I mentioned the DEI piece, but there is also the question of whether climate alarmism has been given too privileged a place on the college campuses. I'm among those who think that the global warming talking points have been wildly exaggerated. We have seen the way in which universities and their faculties broadly cooperated with the U.S. government's efforts to turn the COVID crisis into a mass hysteria. This is one of a number of pieces. One might mention the willingness of universities to embrace the cause of transgenderism and various forms of radical feminism, which again become orthodoxies that can crush the careers of anybody who wishes, as they should be able to dissent, to raise questions, to express admonition over our willingness to accept talking points without evidence and without good scrutiny of the arguments put in favor of those causes. So all those things together wrap up into a broad left-wing agenda that has become too settled on the university campus. No one is calling for the suppression of the people who favor those views, but to have those views treated as sacred cows that can't be questioned at all has become intolerable. Something has to change. Now, driving Claudine Gay out of the presidency of Harvard is a symbolic victory. It doesn't amount to a great change in Harvard itself, which decided to overlook her plagiarism and move her over to the political science department, where she could keep her $900,000 a year salary and continue to practice what looks to most of us as a career of academic dishonesty. Over 700 Harvard faculty members signed a letter agreeing to support Claudine Gay. This is before her resignation, but it tells you that the rot is broad and deep at Harvard, and what is going on there is hardly any different from what's going on at America's other brand name universities, especially in the Ivy League.
And of course, all the objections to her dismissal or resignation suggested that the motives against her were racist and racism, which is inevitable, isn't it? That is the response.
Well, yes. Any of us who speak out realize that if we get the better argument, we will be met simply with the accusation that you are racist. It has been so overused that I think it has lost most of its emotional power at this point. We're indifferent to being called racist because we know we're not. And racism here is merely as Dr. Johnson said, of patriotism being the last refuge of scoundrels. The accusation of racism has become the last refuge of America's academic scoundrels.
Yeah. You mentioned tenure there, a tenured professor who was dismissed in spite of his tenure. But I mean, we both know Roger Kimball, I think, who wrote the book Tenured Radicals. But today, do you not think that tenure is the only thing really protecting conservatives on campus?
Well, I have members of my organization who are tenured professors who plead with me, don't criticize tenure because it's the only thing keeping us in our positions. My answer to them is no, it's not. The only thing that keeps you in your position is your willingness to be outspoken in your opposition, because it's much more difficult to fire a faculty member who has become publicly identified as a conservative than it is to fire a tenured faculty member. The tenured faculty members' protections are proving to be very flimsy, and that's I think it's just better to position yourself as someone too publicly well known to be fired than to go after the safe harbor of tenure. It won't protect you anymore.
And you say anymore, just out of curiosity, has something changed? I mean, was the nature of tenure changed?
Well, tenure is, of course, a legal fiction of sorts. Universities have their rules of employment. They promise tenure to candidates who pass very stringent tests. But what we've seen, first of all, was the dilution of tenure, in which individuals like Claudine Gay, who by no stretch of the imagination came close to meeting the standards for tenure, were given tenure. That was oftentimes connected to racial privilege. It is treating blacks with a lower standard of admissibility than others. And then it spread that the ideologically aligned groups that could expect rightly, I think, the allegiance of others in their cohort were able to game the tenure system to gain positions for people in women's studies, black studies, Hispanic studies, queer studies, and on down the line. With that dilution of what tenure is to become a blanket to protect those in the category of aggrieved minorities, the use of tenure as a way to recognize the faculty members who had risen to the traditional standards was already weakened. But then came the realization that there were ways to subvert their tenure. The favorite tactic of the moment is to declare that the tenured faculty member who speaks out on one of these sacred causes is guilty of lack of collegiality, lack of respect for fellow faculty members or students, and therefore someone who trades in hate speech and is a danger to the community. So tenure, never mind, we need to protect people from the terrible things that you might think or say. Now, until as recently as about a year ago, that theory of a loophole in tenure had no legal status, but has now been tried in at least one court. I think that was in North Carolina, where the court agreed with the university. Yeah, this is a good reason to get rid of people. The folks in Ohio at Ohio Northern University who were going after this law professor named Scott Gerber are trying the same tactic. The reason to get rid of him is his uncollegiality. And what does that consist of? It consists of his dissenting from the DEI orthodoxy. I should mention that this particular faculty member was a star teacher and the most productive academic in the whole university there, with many books and many peer-reviewed articles. Didn't matter. His lack of collegiality doomed him.
You've talked about DEI there. I mean, I think I'm right in thinking that DEI is the sort of fruit of decades of affirmative action in America, or the climax of it in a way, because when America's politicians started introducing affirmative action measures in the 70s, it was understood and it was argued that this would not be a long-term. It wouldn't be necessary to do affirmative action in the long term, and that indeed, if it were, then it should never be done. Do you think perhaps what we're seeing is that affirmative action has run out of road because it's only hardened into the DEI agenda, and actually the logical reasons for doing it have gone?
Well, the affirmative action agenda ran out of road a long time ago. In fact, if you go back to the late 1970s, it looked as though the Supreme Court was going to say the sails of that ship had to be trimmed. That was the famous Bakke case, in which a white applicant to medical school with sterling credentials was turned down in favor of several minority applicants. And Bakke prevailed at the Supreme Court, but it produced this odd decision in which one of the justices, Justice Lewis Powell, pronounced an opinion which is said that the University of California, which was the institution that had declined to admit Bakke, could have won the case had it argued it on different grounds, that instead of seeking social justice for minorities, it should have said that it was seeking diversity, and diversity would be something that would enhance the education of everyone, black, white, and otherwise, because it was just a better way to educate people. It took higher education only a few years to realize affirmative action had run out of road, so now they were going to switch to diversity, and diversity became the calling card for racial preferences for pretty much 2 decades. The diversity movement itself became such a sham that people realized, well, this isn't about admitting people who are just in need of a helping hand and will do just fine when they get here. It ushered in an era of double standards and lower standards. So then we began this slide over to, well, diversity itself isn't getting us what we want, so we will add two more words to the list: diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of these sound like benign things, but if you get to know what they really mean, they're not so benign. Equity means instead of pursuing equality for people, we are going to pursue equality of outcomes. If there are 15% of the population that's black, we want to be sure that 15% of everything in the university is also black. Inclusion is an even more mischievous term. What it means is that the standards by which we judged you in the past are no longer operative. To be included is to be judged by your own standards, and the standards of the black community may be somewhat different from those of the white community. So there we begin the march into the idea that it's white privilege to expect honesty, or white privilege to expect timeliness, or white privilege to grade people by the results of a single test given blindly to the whole population. My identity group deserves to choose what its own standards will be, and that's what inclusion means. When you put those three things together, and it is simply a wrecking ball for the whole idea of a university based on disinterested scholarship in pursuit of truth. That's gone away. Claudine Gay, for example, when she was trying to recover from her disastrous testimony at the House Education and Workforce Committee, said that she had to speak my truth, as though her personal truth was somehow different from the truth. And but there we are. That's entirely consistent with the DEI agenda.
A lot of the argument for affirmative action going into DEI has always been, if you can see it, you can be it, and that people of minority backgrounds would be inspired by seeing people that look like them in positions of power and authority. How do you respond to that? Is that just more racial thinking disguised as progress?
Yes, it is just racial thinking disguised as progress, and anyone can be inspired by anyone whose success stands out as something to be emulated. And the idea that one might find people with the same melanin level in their skin as more inspiring than those who aren't is certainly actively promoted by the race hustlers in America. But it's just not true. We go back to the early 20th century when W.E.B. Du Bois, I think he says it, the author of Souls of Black Folks and one of the first, I think the first black faculty member at Harvard, begins his major work with his confession that he can sit down with Dante and Dante sees no color. And likewise, the American classics are open to anyone who recognizes the classics as such, whether they're American or European or African or otherwise. That readiness of the academic world to judge people on the merits of their ideas is really what's at stake with this notion that you have to be inspired by someone who looks like you or has some ethnic connection to you. It's an unfortunate lie in that it poisons the minds of young people who say, well, why should I bother if I don't see a sufficient number of like-looking people in positions of power? Well, we have had people in positions of power. One might think, for example, of President Barack Obama. That doesn't seem to have inspired a great outpouring of renewed effort on the parts of young black children to do better in schools. One can ask, why not? Well, there are complicated social reasons there to be taken into account. The most important of which is the breakdown of the black family. the fatherlessness of so many children. And we can ask why that is. Well, that goes back to the very beginnings of affirmative action, with the idea that the black bourgeois family was now to be replaced by aid to women with dependent children, and fathers were just a recipe for losing welfare benefits. A social history there that really needs to be attended to carefully to realize what terrible mistakes we've made in social engineering over the last more than half century that cannot easily be undone at this point. If you've grown up fatherless, you're not suddenly going to gain a father. But the result of this has been a hugely defensive attitude on the part of the black community. Don't blame the victim. Well, one does not want to blame the victim, but one has to realize that some forms of victimhood are not easily reversed, and that the real challenge right now is to figure out how to construct a society that is more equitable in the genuine sense of the word. People deserve a fair chance at a start in life, and that requires policies that are pro-natal, that allow families to arise and thrive and give children hope and ambition, so that when they encounter the difficulties of school, and school is difficult for a lot of children, they see themselves as obliged to meet those difficulties and rise above them.
And if there is, and as you've said, that we can't really be sure that there is a genuine revolt against DEI happening across America yet, but if there is such a thing, and it seems like that there's certainly something going on, I wonder, I always ask you about your book, Anger in America, A Bee in the Mouth, Anger in America Today. I think, I wonder how you feel about this new sort of conservative activism or right-wing activism that is quite angry and is not willing to settle for anything less than victory. Does it trouble you? Does it worry you?
It worries me to the extent that the great institutional powers in America, not just the universities, but the whole Washington, D.C. apparatus, our law enforcement authorities, especially the FBI, appear to be spoiling for a fight which will involve violence and turmoil. I, of course, would much rather see a peaceful transfer of power to the more sensible portions of the American populace. It's going to be difficult to have that peaceful transfer when the FBI is busy locking people up for crimes of sedition and of interfering with proper elections on very supposititious grounds. We are seeing a system of brute power being marshaled against people who are perfectly legitimate dissenters within the American Republic. And once you have outlawed dissent, you are setting the stage for revolt. Now, I don't think that revolt arises primarily from Trump or his supporters or anybody else on the right. I think it arises from a growing realization that they have been denied a legitimate voice in the governance of the country. And by governance, I mean not simply how elections are run, but how our major institutions are run. We see over and over again, whether it's the Hollywood and the television world or book publishing, the mass media, all seem to be aligned solidly on the idea that they call it our democracy is at risk from having people genuinely free to express their views. Now, I try to walk a careful line here. I do not want to be cornered into supporting one party or candidate, but I certainly see that the anger in America has a legitimate base, and that it is being fomented by the tactics of the establishment to the point where we easily could have a more serious breakdown of order in the country. why it is that President Biden and others in his administration seem to welcome that and are thirsting for the breakdown of such order baffles me. But I understand that we are headed in that direction. So if you're asking me if I'm worried, the answer is yes.
Well, on that worrying note, we'll end it there. Thank you very much, Peter Wood. Thank you very much for coming on to The View from 22. Please come on again in this year of elections and possible counter-revolutions.